Welcome, everybody. Welcome to London Futurists. My name is David Wood, and in a moment I'll hand over to today's panelists for what I expect is going to be a fascinating discussion on the topic, the future starts now. And on that point, we all have a choice. We can choose to accept the future as it unfolds, designed by other people. Perhaps we try to adapt to what Shakespeare called the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or we can choose to take steps to envision and accelerate a future that we design, our future. That's one of the themes of the book, some of whose authors are joining us today. We're going to be hearing from 4 of these authors, of whom 2 have the additional role of editing the entire book. First, though, a quick word to the audience. If questions come to your mind as you listen to the discussion, feel free to write them into the Q&A window, which you should find a button for somewhere below the screen. And my tip to you is to try to write a short question rather than a full-on essay. Then other audience members may have the chance to choose to give your question a thumbs-up endorsement if they wish to hear the panelists answering that question as a priority. So we're now going to hear a few minutes from each of the panelists explaining who they are and what they've written about in the book. Before we go to a fuller discussion, I'll ask them to introduce themselves as they speak, and let's start with Bronwyn Williams. Bronwyn, take it away.
Hi, thank you so much for allowing us to come and talk to you this evening. Although it is a little bit like preaching to the choir, because the purpose of this book that Theo and I got together to try and put together was really to get people that aren't involved in the formal futures industry involved with futures conversations, because that's really the challenge that we've seen in this space, that we either have sort of pop futurists that are preaching to us about singularity and about, abundance forever on the one hand. On the other hand, we have very good work being done in academia that just doesn't seem to filter down into everyday consciousness. So I put together a very short presentation. I'm not going to take up too much of your time tonight because, of course, as I said, the whole point of this is to exactly try and democratize the future a little bit more. But I do think it's also quite useful for you to kind of understand a bit of the ethos behind it and our thinking that got us to the point of wanting to put this project together. As I said, it is also worth bearing in mind this is targeted not towards the core futures community, but rather to the general wider world out there that might not be as advanced in these conversations that we have been. And to start with, of course, we like to say, that Theo and I have both said quite a lot, that there's quite a big sense at the moment that something's happened to the future. It's sort of disappeared. It seems to be, the horizon seems to be shrinking. Those headlights in front of our sort of spaceship Earth seem to be dimming a little bit. So we're not having productive conversations as to where we could be headed. Quite a lot of our conversations about the future on a global level tend to be quite dystopian. We can see this through from science fiction that is no longer aspirational, it's more dystopian and things to avoid. We can see this in conversations that have been had that are all to do, particularly coming from political leaders. They're tending more and more towards conservative type thinking and trying to sort of preference today, high time preferences, rather than sort of big, audacious, civilizational, generational goals. We seem to have lost a lot of that aspiration. And of course, the classic idea that we see there is that whole concept of like, where's my flying car? We were promised this 100 years ago. 100 years ago, we had fantastic ideas about the abundant, technologically driven, hugely fantastical futures that we could be having. And at the moment, we're still sort of playing around with those second-hand ideas. We're not seeming to come up with the new visions as to where we're headed next. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Of course, that biggest one being this whole sense of we are afraid. We're afraid as a society this is as good as it's going to get. There's a sense of stagnation across a lot of the developed world. And in the developing world, there's a sense of frustration that we're unable to take charge of our own destiny. There seems to just be too many physical, financial, and social challenges to overcome. And we've seen this in waves of unrest across particularly our youthful populations across the world. And we want to try change those conversations. So we have to say sort of what went wrong with the future and how we're going to fix it going ahead. Because instead of flying cars, we have instead overcrowded, very dystopian cities, like you can see on the screen there. So we have an aerial tram instead of like a personal flying car. It's not quite the future that we were all trying to get excited about. And that's not a future that we can get people to buy into very much. It's certainly not for big, grand, audacious goals if we want to see real change and solve the real problems that we're experiencing as a whole society. And just to sort of illustrate this point, I love to use this image because I think it really does speak to how small our goals and our dreams have become, even within our own lifespans, never minding those intergenerational projects that we really should be thinking about. This is from a company called Podshare in Silicon Valley that rents these bunk beds out for around about, I think it's $1,200 a month to young people, not just students, to young working professionals. So that's all they've got to aspire to. So much for the white picket fence and the dog and the kid and the husband in the car in the garage. You just get a bunk bed. That's pretty much it. And this is the aspirational goal of the frontier of the developed world. Now, me sitting in South Africa, if I'm trying to inspire teenagers and young students to get excited about the future, and they see that this is the best future that's on offer, even in America, which is still held up across a lot of the developing world as this aspirational point we should all be working towards, well, that's not that exciting. That's a very shrunk horizon. And of course, we've got those other competing visions that are telling us that due to very real concerns about sustainability, the environmental and the social sustainability of the systems that govern our world, that perhaps people need to be content with the idea of being dependent on some sort of central power, whether that is a private city that's run by a very wealthy individual, or whether that's a sort of benevolent type of World Economic Forum, G20 type program, whereby everyone's going to get universal basic income. In exchange, you're going to give up a bit of your privacy. In exchange, you're going to give up a bit of autonomy over your own life. You're going to have to follow a few more rules, but you won't own anything. You'll have to rent pretty much everything. You're not going to be able to own this economy, but you'll kind of be looked after. And that's a pretty low bar utopian vision, the way it's being sold, because it's not really going to give us all fully automated luxury communism that's on the table. It's more like fully automated, maybe sort of lower middle class communism that's kind of on the table. These are the stories that we're hearing more and more that are being held up as aspirations rather than what they are, which is kind of like a way for us to survive a future that isn't necessarily going the way that we wanted it to go for. We're also hearing a lot of conversations about saying we've kind of got no frontiers to get to. There doesn't seem to be a sense of where we can go and where we can grow to change these things. That whole sense of sort of accepting this is as good as it gets is not for me a particularly exciting story. We'd like to be part of trying to change that narrative because not all of us like that particular vision. And that's not to say that some of you don't like that particular vision, and that's also okay, but definitely from my perspective, and I think Theo and a lot of the other authors involved in this project agree, what we really need is more choices, more futures visions on the table, rather than these sort of very homogenous views that are being sort of imposed upon people. And that's what we want to break out of, the sort of sense that in the near term, all sort of futures that are being sort of preached from positions of power and privilege have some sorts of version of a kind of a neo-feudal element to it, whereby the masses are dependent on a very small select body of elites. And as we go further ahead, the even more depressing cliff that futurism seems to fall off into a kind of a singularity black hole. It says this is kind of, we're heading towards the end of the human project as we know it. So what's the point of planning if we're not even going to be here due to some either extinction event or some sort of artificial intelligence, Armageddon, whatever it might be. There seems to be a darkness in the conversation. We really want to break free from that and put some more ideas on the table. So as I like to say, we need new stories, not secondhand, one-size-fits-all futures. And to do that, we need more diverse, new voices in the room engaging in these conversations rather than just sort of accepting the prevailing views as to where we headed as spaceship Earth. We need more people involved in the conversation. And because of that, when Theo and I started talking about writing a book, when we're talking about trying to put more voices onto the table, it doesn't make much sense for me and him to sit down and write a book from our perspective. That would kind of be a grand irony when the message we're trying to get is quite different. So instead, what we did is we sat down and found 20 very, very different, interesting people from all across the world You'll find most regions of the world have been represented here. Some names are quite well known in the futures community. Others are completely unknown. It will be very new to people, even that have been involved in this space for some time. And we've got them all to write about something that they are concerned about when it comes to the future, a topic that they are passionate about, something that they want to see more people talking about and more change and more urgency being applied. And the issues are very, very diverse. They really do feature whatever that particular person cares about and is written from their perspective. They've also been quite careful to find people that we disagree with in this list too, because again, it wasn't supposed to be us telling people how to think. It was trying to encourage people to think for themselves and to reject views and ideas they don't think are going to work for their own selves and their own lives going forward. And so that is quite enough for me. As I've said, this book was not supposed to be about us, it was supposed to be about everyone else. So I would like to hand over back to David, and he can take us from there.
Thanks so much, Bronwyn. I've got huge numbers of questions, but I'm going to put them all on hold because I want to hear from your great assembled group. As you said, people with diverse voices, even some disagreements. So let's go to Kate O'Neill in New York. Kate, maybe you can introduce yourself and tell us a bit about the chapter you've written in this book.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. And thank you, Bronwyn and Theo, for the opportunity to be part of this project. It's been really fun to watch and be part of and see how well received it's been all along. So my chapter in this book is called Everything is Connected. It's a philosophy that I hold very dear. And it was one that I think it was a title that was actually in Theo and Bronwyn's proposed set of titles for chapters. And I just went, oh, that's me, pluck, I'm taking that. That's exactly what I say. So it was a fun opportunity to explore at a very macro level a lot of what I write about and speak about in terms of the intersection of technology, data and emerging technology on the future of meaningful human experiences. So I speak to companies and cities and organizations about how they can build their technology futures, how they can do digital transformation, how they can lay a data infrastructure in place and data strategy that can help them build the best possible futures for the most people. And this was a great opportunity to talk about the fact that I think that much of what Bronwyn just said is very much echoed in what I'm about to say and in my chapter. I think that the notion of dystopia and utopia is way too polarized a set of ideas that we have to be able to have a very both and mindset about the way we think about those things, that the risks and the opportunities are both present, and we need models and approaches that are going to allow us to mitigate the worst while hoping and working toward the best of those outcomes. And I think the way we do that is by recognizing that the data that's ever present, that's being collected all around us, that we can talk about through the internet transactions, the sort of web-based transactions, as well as more and more kind of Internet of Things and beacons and sensors and more ambient kinds of technologies that are tracking the movements of humans through time and space. It's very important to recognize that that data does represent humanity, that it represents human interests and needs and motivations and behaviors and relationships and all of that kind of thing. So the more we can humanize that, the more we can think about how to create meaningful experiences from it. And the reason why I keep stressing meaningful experiences is because I keep coming back in my life. I'm a linguist by education who has now been working for 25 years in technology. And so I always bring this language lens to everything. And for me, I've just learned to appreciate that meaning is in everything that we talk about and that we do. And it's a very abstract concept, I think, for many people. We talk about making things meaningful or what the meaning of something is, but it turns out I think that it's abstract because it is so loaded with meaning. There's a lot of meanings upon which in which we think about meaning. We think about semantic meaning, how we communicate what we mean to each other, what we're trying to say to one another. We can think about truth and patterns and purpose and significance and relevance and all of these kinds of layers, all the way out to the most macro, abstract kinds of meaning, like existential and cosmic meaning, like what's it all about and why are we here? every one of those kinds of layers of meaning is very important to human experience. And when we can appreciate and understand that and have some sort of mental rigor for how we think about that, then we have the opportunity to actually design the experiences of now and of the future in a way that can really amplify that meaning and give us the best possible chance of having a future that is full of significance for us. And so at every level that I'm talking about there, what meaning is about is what matters. Meaning is always about what matters. And so I actually feel like one of the most revelatory realizations here is that you can also frame innovation and the future developments as what is going to matter. And that keeps it in a very human-oriented lens on the future and on innovation. So we can keep with that sort of meaning-centered approach of what matters and what is going to matter. And when we do that, it gives us an entirely fresh perspective on how to think about technologies that are solving human problems, how to bring those to scale in meaningful ways, how to create opportunities where maybe we move past the need for humans to necessarily be involved in jobs in the long distant future, and how that's going to look, what it means to have meaningful experiences that go beyond deriving our identities and our sense of accomplishment from the jobs that we do and the work that we contribute. So there's a lot of opportunity that I think those kinds of lenses open up for us. And further, I think that one of the other important things I think that I got to explore here that I think is a really important part of this future-oriented discussion is to bring social justice into the discussion and make sure we're really thinking about, as Bronwyn talked about, the diversity of views and voices that are represented in the discussion, but also making sure that, you know, people, the stakeholders are many, and that the people who are being impacted are considered at every point in the discussion. So thinking about impact versus intent, as opposed to, you know, where our intentions were good, but the impact was terrible. You know, we have to be thinking about impact instead. And then the one other point here is that I got a chance to weave in something that's I'm very passionate about, which is the roadmap for all of this, for being able to understand how to do a very dimensional approach to meaningful experiences and how to create the best possible futures for the most possible people. I think a really great start is what the United Nations has laid out with its Sustainable Development Goals, and those 17 goals that have articulated so well all of the different facets upon which we need to improve in order to make human life and all life really flourish on this planet. I know we're going to need to move past that eventually, but we have a long way to go before we have achieved what needs to be achieved within the roadmap of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think for the time being, we have a lot of clarity that those goals provide us. So that's the gist of it, and I'm really thrilled to have been able to lay out some of those ideas. I'm happy to discuss them further, and I'm very happy to hand it back over to David now to take it further in the group.
Many thanks. And just a quick follow-up from me, Kate. You said that you're not so keen on extreme utopian or extreme dystopian, but you have a sign behind you saying you're an optimistic futurist. So maybe just say a little bit about that, your grounds for optimism in the midst of all the other things you've spoken about.
Yeah, thanks. I love that follow-up because it gives me a chance to say I'm working on my own book that follows from here is very similar to this chapter. It sort of unpacks it even further, and the notion there is strategic optimism. And I believe what we have the opportunity to do is to recognize the best possible outcome in any given scenario. Sure, we recognize the worst that can happen, the risks that there are, we lay in place plans for that. But I think that we, in general, tend to focus way too much on mitigating the negative. And in strategic environments, in business environments especially, I see this happen, where an awful lot of time and energy is spent on how do we prepare for what could go wrong? And not nearly enough time is spent on how do we prepare for what could go right, and how can we make sure that things are moving toward the right side, the best side of those outcomes. So that I believe that optimism is a very strategic attribute, and the way we need to put that in place is in a very measured and disciplined approach.
Well, we might dig more into this concept, strategic optimism, later. That's
Sure.
quite an interesting one. Let's switch over now to Theo Priestley, if I may. Theo is in Edinburgh, one of the co-editors of this book as well, and a chapter author too. Theo, maybe you can introduce yourself and share with us some of your thoughts, please.
Hi, sure. Firstly, my name is Theo Priestley. I'm kind of regarded as a very cynical and anti-futurist in a sense. Primarily because my background started off as being a bit of an evangelical about technology and where it could lead us. And the more I dug into that, the more I found, well, actually, some of these paths are not where we want to go. So I kind of sort of railed against a lot of the happy and utopian views. I don't necessarily prescribe towards the dystopian ones, but I do see the disadvantages of heading in that direction. And again, part of the concept of this book when talking with Bronwyn was to examine how we can give everybody else a stake in this future and take this outside of the futurist circle. So when people pick up this book and read it and read the chapters, it should have this conversational effect where they feel like they're having this chat with one of the authors of the chapters, and then it sparks some kind of conversation in their own head to say, well, I feel passionate about this topic, or I feel passionate about the other chapter. What do I need to do about it? And that was kind of the groundwork for the book itself. And that's kind of what I do when I speak with clients as well, whether they're on a personal level or whether it's on a corporate level. It's what are we looking at right now? Where do we want to go? What are the steps in front of us in terms of technology, business strategy, that kind of thing? And then how do we make sure that we're taking the right decisions and understanding all the impacts? So Kate touched on that, and Bronwyn's touched on that as well, in terms of understanding all the knock-on impacts. So it's not a case of let's plan for the best possible scenario or potential future that we can. It's understanding, if I take that first step, where does that branch off to? And if I take the next one, where does that branch off to as well? And I don't think we do enough of the let's question every branch kind of thing. We just follow the right path. In a sense, but we don't question whether it's the correct path for everybody, not just for me. So if I had to make a decision, how is it going to affect Bronwyn, Craig, Kate, David, and everyone else in this room? My chapter in itself is about artificial intelligence, or certainly AI as a concept, but AI as a concept in business and how we can start to restructure organizations around that concept. So originally I did a topic for a TED Talk on what it would be like to have a robot boss, and the impacts of that, and also the impacts of having a robot leadership in society, whether it's the next politician or world leader, and what does that mean for people as and humans in a sense? So does that mean that we're all beholden to a robot overlord, or does it give humanity a chance to rediscover what it means to be and redefine what it means to be human in the scale of, or under the branch of so much automation? I'm a believer that we've gone through so many different iterations of industrial kind of revolutions. AI, or certainly machine learning or deep learning, however you want to term it, is just, or algorithmic, is just another revolution in itself. We're not going to lose so many jobs to AI. It's not going to make us into extremely lazy species, and we all have to beg for UBI, for example, or we all need to seek meaning on Mars because there's no meaning left on Earth. I think there's plenty meaning to be found as individuals. My hope is that by restructuring businesses around AI, or certainly around a lot more sophisticated automation, that it gives us more time to discover what it means to be satisfied at work, what it means to be satisfied intrinsically as people. So, I mean, for example, during the pandemic, I've re-examined, what it means for me to go to work. What does that mean? Well, going to work no longer means commuting. It means just coming in my pajamas, sitting in front of the screen and making frequent trips to the kitchen for cups of tea. And that's my commute. But it also means that I've re-examined how I structure my day, because we view productivity in very binary at the moment, which is if I'm sitting at my desk, I am productive. And that's the measure of my productivity, which is presenteeism, and that is it. Whereas you can be ultra productive in the first hour of the day, in the last hour of the day, even midday, but you're still allowed to pick up a book, read a chapter, go out for a walk the dog, converse with your children, watch TV, whatever you want to do. And I've discovered that, I've been freelancing for a long time, but even then you kind of get into this kind of sort of pattern where you believe work is one thing. And I've restructured my life around what I now see as a different style of work. And now I've discovered the love of writing screenplays, for example. I used to write, instead of writing for business publications or anything else like that, I'm starting to enjoy writing for myself and exploring that kind of creative side. So this is kind of what I see for society. If we see higher levels of automation, what it shouldn't do is allow us to be, more productive 5 days a week. It should actually release us from 5 days and say, well, we can achieve those 5 days in 3 days. We don't need to fill those other 2 days with more work. Why don't we fill those 2 days or extra days with something that has meaning for me or meaning for each one of us as a person, as an individual? So it's more about, my chapter is about how do we restructure business and how do we employ AI to create more freedom for people rather than enslave us to work faster and harder under the guise of something else.
Let me just quickly ask you about the screenplays that you're writing. I mean, are they futurist screenplays? Are they screenplays about people turning up at work and finding they've got a robot boss?
No, I mean, as you can see, my bookshelves are completely filled with science fiction. And it's mostly pulp science fiction. I mean, if I reach in here, and it is very kind of sort of me in a sense, especially I guess the book. And my cynical view of futurism is that I had I really enjoyed the visions of the future that came out in the 1920s, the 30s, and the 40s, straight after the Depression and the First World War. And we had the World's Fair, and there was so much excitement around what the future held, the atomic energy. We've even had like flying cars and self-driving cars back then, ideas of what home automation would look like and how it would free us. And instead, what we've got now is, like Bronwyn has said, we've had pop culture futurists banging on about the singularity for the last 40 years because that's the breadth of their imagination now. It all seems to stop where we are all wearing headsets and chips. And that's our future to accept. Whereas I kind of I've got about 600 of these books or little sort of serial books from the 60s all the way up to modern day, which is all future visions written by science fiction authors. And I absolutely gorge on science fiction because you get more out of science fiction than I do out of business books, which is ultimate irony given I've just written one. But my screenplays are based on science fiction and just ideas, and it's just me exploring stuff in general. So I have a couple of ideas at the moment. One is for a film, another one is for a TV series, which I'm writing the pilot and then everything else around that to see if I can pitch it. I have absolutely zero experience in writing screenplays. It's just completely self-taught using the software that's out there and having the conversations with a few connections that are in that particular industry. But for me, it's just an outlet of creativity that I didn't know I had. I wanted to write novels before and then suddenly understood that the way I structured the books or the way I was trying to write a novel was actually more like a screenplay. All the action was in my head. I had set pieces thought out, dialogue, that kind of sort of thing. And really what I was doing in my head was trying to force a screenplay into a novel. And so I've kind of unraveled that. And now I'm just sort of writing screenplays.
We'll talk more later probably about the comparative methods, comparative merits of business books versus science fiction. But let's first bring in the fourth panelist, Craig Wing, who is also in South Africa today. Craig, perhaps you could introduce yourself and tell us about the chapter that you've contributed to this book, please.
Sure, I will do, David. Thanks for having me. And to Theo and Bronwyn, thanks for inviting me to be part of this book. And Kate, great to finally meet you. I've heard a lot about you. I look forward to your book coming out as well. So to kick off, my background is a little bit different. Perhaps more of a formal perspective. I've gone through the engineering degrees and masters and all the rest. But part of the last 6 years, I've been a futurist of the company, and in many respects, I was part of that position, part of that world that spoke around a singular future. This is where it's going to be. It's great. It's wonderful. And the more I scratch the surface, the more I realize not only is that not always applicable, but it's not really appropriate. Because exactly to your point, Theo, it's a multitude of different futures, and to not bring that to the fore is a disservice for not only our customers and the clients around the world that I speak to, but also for ourselves, because it starts to polarize our thinking, right? And so when the request came through from Bronwyn and Theo, hey, we've got this incredible project that we want to do, would you like to be part of it? My first inclination was, this sounds like a hell of a lot of fun, because I know Bronwyn's a hell of a lot of fun, and so the company she must keep must surely be fun, as well as certainly thought-provoking and excellent, and it will be an absolute honor to be part of that. But even more than that, and David, you alluded to this in your intro, right? One of the great sayings that, specifically this book alludes to is that by a guy called William Jennings Bryan. He's an American politician who was born in 1860, right? So 160 odd years ago. And he said this, which is fantastic. He says, destiny is not a matter of chance. It is a matter of choice. And then he goes on, says, it is not a thing to be waited for. It is a thing to be achieved. And part of the beauty of this project was exactly that, because often the futures come down from, the tech gods, from the governments, from the speakers on stage, and say, this is the future, let me preach to it, and I'll tell you where it's going to be. And that's certainly not the case. It's not singular, it's indeterministic, right? And part of that is to say, well, what's the multiple futures, and how do I create the ones that I want by understanding what is the preferable futures? Myself, right now, I'm doing my PhD. I'm doing a PhD in futures thinking, specifically around something called the efficacy of backcasting. And that's really to say, well, in as much as it's imperative to think about the future, how well does this actually work for companies from a strategic point of view? It sounds great, but does it actually work? And there's very scant research about that. So that's actually what I'm doing. So enough about that, but the chapter itself, I talk about something called Homo Augeritus, which is a term that I've made up, which is derived from the Latin term augment, right? So if I stumble upon the word, it's because I'm not Latin, as you can probably see, or that's not a criteria to speak Latin. But Homo Augeritus is really about saying, well, what's the augmentation and what happens next? And Theo, almost carrying on the point that you had around AI, what does it mean to be human, is kind of what I touch on in this book. So how do you go from Homo sapiens, and what's the next step of evolution? Because one of the things from a biological point of view was specifically our evolution was going between what was between our ears. And now I know for a lot of leaders and a lot of politicians, there's a lot of white spaces. But in general, it's about saying the size of our cranium, the size of the brain matter determine how much we evolved. And if you look at that specifically from a mass index to the rest of your body, what we'll realize, we've reached almost a pivot point right now, because it's no longer about what we can put inside of our heads, but it's what we can attach to our heads nowadays, which is the key, right? And that starts us towards this Homo Augeritus piece, which is about saying, how do you augment the human being? Now, that's two pieces. One is the external stuff. That's all the way from saying, whether it is blades if you're running, whether it's a 3D or not 3D, a different kind of eye implants that allows you to see 400, 500, 600 meters, maybe even kilometers, who knows, or miles if you're in the US. What does it mean when you're able to have different kinds of implants that allow you to have different kinds of strength, exoskeletons, etc.? Or maybe even differently, it's from a prenatal point of view. When as a parent, you have a decision to say, well, with CRISPR, for argument's sake, what happens when you can do something like increase your child's intelligence by 15 basis points? Would you do that for $10,000? Would you pay $30,000 to ensure they have more fast twitch fibers so they can run quickly? Or would you pay $50,000 to make sure they're 6'4"? Heaven knows I would pay a little bit more to be a little bit taller than what I am right now, right? So it's all about those kinds of questions. And when you start branching off into this, it's the branch between Homo sapiens, which most of us all are. Again, as I said, some are a little bit less advanced, but from Homo sapiens to Homo Augeritus. And so where my chapter starts talking about what are some of the social implications of this? How will we react in a time when you can have these kinds of implants, when you can say, well, there's a next level of evolution, shall we say, albeit not governed by natural laws, but by what we can attach to ourselves. And from there, what does it mean from questions such as rights? Kate just spoke about social justice. Is there new social justice coming through? At what point do I lose our humanity when it's 20% robotic, non-human, shall we say, 30%, 40%, 50%? At what point does it start to switch over, right? And many of these questions we actually have a precedence for today based on how we treat folks who are different to us. I was at a panel with Bronwyn a while ago, and the questions around saying, well, what does gender discrimination look like? And one of the things that I posit in this chapter is, well, there's a new kind of discrimination that's coming very soon. It's around saying, how do we treat those folks that have different kinds of implants? One of which is, let's say, in athletics. Do you treat someone that's classically, or let's say genetically, from an external point of view, male versus female, but then you have to look at the testosterone levels? What do you do across the board over there? In South Africa, with an athlete, Caster Semenya, where her testes are inside, and so she's got more adrenaline than your classical or your typical kind of woman. And what does that mean across the levels of competition? But even more so, when you start augmenting the human being, what does that mean, right? And so I touch on all these different pieces. And if you think what I'm talking about is crazy, well, we've been doing it since almost the dawn of man, because we've already genetically modified crops, we've genetically modified wild dogs and you know, wolves to become pets. From an attachment point of view, we've been doing it already with pacemakers. We're doing it with glasses. We're doing it with the hearing horn. We're even doing it right now with smartwatches. It's just that when it goes subcutaneous, we really start to freak out about it. And it's almost like the natural progression of what's going to happen. There's no doubt about it. So my chapter is really about talking around those things and what's the new kinds of discrimination. Will we bifurcate in society? Will we have a different kind of rules for one set, the Homo sapiens, and another set of rules for Homo Augeritus? Will the Homo Augeritus rise up and say, well, you know, you're an inferior species, those of you that choose not to be enhanced? And what does that mean from there? And I guess combining all of these things, I leave a few questions. The most important one is, we've reached a point of technology right now where it's no longer a question of should we. It's more of a question of it's no longer a question of could we, it's now a question of should we. Should we do this? Should we not do that? That's really the question. And more than that, it's this future that we're going into. It becomes a question of saying, well, the future isn't deterministic, and we are going to make mistakes. We are going to stuff up along the way, right? And it's all about focusing on the and, not the or. But more importantly, this future that we're hurtling in towards, one that is completely different to the stories that we heard in the 1920s, 1930s. And what I say, and ultimately the final line in my book is, you know, in this world that we're going into, we need to lead, we need to be human beings that have more wisdom, more kindness, more humility, and perhaps above all, more forgiveness. So that's really the summation of my chapter, and I'll hand it back to you, David.
Many thanks, Craig. And do you think it's right to think of these enhancements as making us lose our humanity, or are we arguably becoming humanity plus or enhanced?
It's an exceptional question, and I think, again, it's a very similar kind of question that I was alluding to around Caster Semenya. It becomes a cultural question. It's no longer a question of science you can measure, right? The question is, at what point do we become human or human plus? That answer, I suspect, what's going to happen from a global perspective. Each country is going to have its own definition. And they'll say, well, you know, it's this percentage, that percentage. One is a prime example is sports right now, right? Without a doubt, and again, I shared this, the talk that I had with Bronwyn, the elite athletes today, whether you want to call them the Lionel Messi's, Cristiano Ronaldo's, you know, Michael Jordan's of old, you know, Lewis Hamilton, they're all freaks to some degree. They have got some kind of enhancement already, a natural one, albeit, but they're already above us. Do we call them superhumans? Do we call them human plus? Do we call them human less? I don't know. But it changes from country to country. And I think culturally what we're going to find is you'll start seeing this split globally of some countries will say, well, they're human plus, other ones are saying they're human minus. And we may start seeing countries where at the initial points, they're saying, come to us, we'll do it because of regulation, and we're going to make you a human plus. Whereas other countries are saying, no, this is not going to happen. So certainly an interesting point. And, you know, like any good consultant, any good futurist, I have not answered your question because we just don't know. We just don't know. And that's why you have to buy the book and get the answer.
Well, we're going to try and dig into some more of the answers now. Let's go around again. Let's say this time try and answer maybe in 2 minutes rather than 7 to 10 minutes. What I've got to suggest, whilst the audience now thinks and maybe submit some questions in the Q&A window, there are some things I'd like to follow up with. So I'll give you a chance to maybe comment tonight any of 3 things. One, you might just comment on what you've heard from somebody else if you thought that really needs amplification or contradiction. Perhaps by all means contradict or amplify what you've heard from each other. Secondly, I was interested, Bronwyn said, well, we're sort of preaching to the choir here. But it's not entirely true, because I think many who are in the audience, they would be sort of futurist enthusiasts, but they're by no means academically trained futurists. And Bronwyn, you did say that you think there are many important insights from academic work on foresight which deserve a wider spreading. And I know there's some in your book, but if any of you want to highlight a model or a framework or a way of thinking that academic futurists, professional futurists have developed, then maybe comment on that. And the third option is about roadmap. And Kate, you mentioned about a roadmap towards more meaningful experience. You referred to the United Nations SDGs, but are there other points forward on a roadmap that any of you care about, things that you think we should be collectively focusing on doing sooner to help us along the way? So let's go in the same order as before. Bronwyn, take your pick.
Thanks. I think I'll pick up on what you said about the whole thing of how we got a lot of these great ideas that have come out of academia, particularly people that have done postgrads and futures like myself and Craig and some of the other people here have done, that can be so valuable to individuals' lives. And it seems to me that a lot of the sort of, particularly the academic portion of futurism and foresight is geared towards very big organizations and geared towards the public sector, quite frankly. In fact, that's a lot of what you're trained to do if you do these courses that are at a postgrad level. And the models are so valuable to even down to sort of teenagers that are able to look at their own life and plot out the sort of future possibilities of their lives. You know, we don't have these conversations with young people. We try and put them into a deterministic, homogenous, one-size-fits-all future. You say, like, what are you going to be when you grow up? You know, like, where are you going to get to? Right? So we try and limit people's futures, and we are brought up to think that way across a lot of our systems, rather than be brought up to think about that whole future horizons. Even just the concept of like the future funnel. When I've had these conversations with kids at school that have no concept of what futurism is, they get so excited about that because suddenly they understand that the future is not a determined place that they've sort of been dragged towards by older people. It's rather a wide open field that they get to define. Some very basic concepts. I think that they are so useful, and they definitely would have been useful to me when I was 14 or 15 or 16 years old, to be able to think of the world in that way, to understand the probable, the possible, and all the rest of it, and just the basic skills and abilities to start to scan the horizon, to look for opportunities, to connect dots. These are skills that we're going to need in a world that is going to become more automated, where we're shifting from jobs to work, where it's not a salary anymore. It's more a case of how do you add value to society. These are sort of models we should be looking at, and we can be applying. They're not the exclusive domain of professionals, of the public sector, of bureaucrats sitting in offices. They should be tools in really everyone's hands. I think that would make for a much more exciting world if we spent less time navel gazing and more time being able to sort of raise our eyes and see the full spectrum of possibility available to us.
The full spectrum involves multiple different disciplines. People talk about PESTLE sometimes, politics and economics and science and technology and environment and law, perhaps. And if we just try and map out the future with one particular insight, we're very likely to come unstuck or be wrapped in our own little cocoon. Kate, anything to add?
Yeah, a couple of the questions, the prompts that you put out there made me want to dig in, but I also wanted to respond or comment on Craig's wonderful commentary and chapter description, and just point out that one of the things that I'm very excited about, one of the types of emerging technology that I'm very excited about is augmented reality. And the reason for that is it does feel like there is an opportunity to create sort of just in time additional layers of meaning that's responsive, that's augmented, that doesn't necessarily require that ethical consideration of subcutaneous, you know, what does it mean to be human, you know, how much of this augmentation are we living with in our own bodies and so on. I think those are incredibly important questions. The CRISPR question and the implant question, all of those types of technologies are incredibly important to hash through. But that's one of the reasons why augmented reality feels like such a huge opportunity to me, is because it feels like it gives us so much of what's possible there without having to necessarily address those weedy questions of the ethics of the implants and so on, and the genetic mutation is on, which again, we need to answer those questions. But just that feels like a really huge opportunity. Like there have been 2 times in my life, in my entire 47-year life, where I had the experience of feeling the tingles on the back of the neck, where like I felt like, oh my gosh, this is going to change everything. And one time was when I saw the graphical web browser for the first time, and it was 93, I think, in Mosaic, and my mind was blown, and I thought, this is going to change everything, and it did, of course. And the other time was, only a decade or whatever it was ago when I saw augmented reality for the first time, maybe however many years ago that was. And I had that same sensation and thought, this is going to change everything. And it really hasn't yet. But I think it still could. I think there's a lot of unexplored potential there that I'm really, really excited about. And I think so I think just kind of dovetailing over really briefly into the roadmap prompt, this is where I think we have the opportunity to think about really robust models for ethics around data and technology, and what it's going to mean to augment our experiences and augment ourselves, right? And I think so much of that is going to be guided by an understanding of power and data ownership and the ease of manipulation of that data and what the consequences of manipulating that data are, and so on. So I think there's an awful lot to unpack there, but I think a really robust model and approach for understanding what an ethics roadmap looks like, what an ethics timeline looks like how to make sure we have the right types of responsibility understood in place at each of the different stages as we're rolling out different kinds of technology. I think that question is going to be incredibly important.
Thanks. Theo?
I'm going to pick up on a couple of points. One is the Kate's augmented reality, which is actually quite interesting because, and the reason I think because we haven't reached that kind of critical mass moment yet, is the platform. I think we're still in this glass hole, shall we say, state that was coined when Google Glass came out, which is we're trying to force a medium on people that does not feel natural. It's funny because everyone seems to be ignoring the mobile phone, of which has such mass market penetration. It should have been the de facto device to actually get it out to people, to let them play around with it, but instead it's been wrapped up in like little games and stuff, so it's never really been taken seriously. The other thing as well is that I think that we're almost reaching a pivotal point in another shift where back in 2007, where just before we had Nokia, and all we had really in a sense of innovation was interchangeable covers that you could buy for 20 quid down the phone shop, and everything was based on Symbian, and then your choices were either Nokia or Sony Ericsson or something like that, Symbian OS, an interchangeable cover, or you were a BlackBerry person because you were in business. Then the iPhone came along and upturned everything and says, well, actually, you don't need to accept any of that. It's all software driven, but here's something really cool that you can play with. And then now we've got this fork again where we're at with Apple versus, well, iOS versus Android. But the innovation has now stopped and stagnated into, well, the size of screen, we can only go this way, or we can add so many camera lenses to the back. So it's almost like a Gillette moment where we're stuck with a shaver and the only innovation that we have is to add more blades. There's nothing else that we can do with it. And I kind of see that somewhere there is somebody in a lab somewhere that is going to upend the mobile phone industry. And come up with something completely different. It's not going to be a swivel phone or anything, or a foldable phone, and that might be where AR has its pivotal moment. And then jumping to Craig's points of view about transcendental humans and where we're going with that, I think my point that I'd like to make is that technology will always be 5 or 6 steps ahead of policy. And we do have a section in the book about policy, which is written by Chris Yu. But I do feel that governmental policy and regulation is always playing catch up because of the rate of change that we allow the tech giants and everyone else to dictate what the pace of change should be, and everyone else is following up. And I was attending a virtual conference based in Belgium, so it was hybrid. But my session was around the old sort of what would AI do? What if AI commits a crime? And you had that kind of sort of scenario where the car chooses between two people which one to kill and which one to save. And one of the questions that I had was, would there ever be a universal application or law that would govern AI, for example? And my answer was no, because we've seen already in the past and where we are even today that one, regulation and policy is so far behind where technology is leading us. It's always playing catch up. And two, every country is trying to define its own policies and laws around AI, around how it treats it, around how it defines it, around the ethics of it. We have so many ethics bodies, for example, trying to come up with their own versions and standards, that there's never going to be one encompassing universal or earthbound sort of policy that governs what we do with technology, what we do about transcendental humans, how we classify them, what we do about AI, how we classify that, how do we treat AI if it commits a crime, you know, do we govern it and do we try it by the same courts of laws that we have as humans, or do we have to come up with an entirely new legal system and framework and how we define where the line of responsibility lies for when an algorithm commits something? So, you know, I think my point is, one is on the AR side, we're going to see a tech shift at some point. Don't ask me what it's going to be, but I think we're reaching this pivotal moment of apathy, I guess, in that we have this ubiquitous platform and there's nothing else to do with it other than size. And the other thing, going to Craig's point, and it applies wider in terms of emerging technologies, is just how do we govern, how do we define, how do we stop different countries actually applying their own laws, or should we allow them? I mean, what if a person who's an augmented human steps between one country and another and they have different laws? Suddenly the definition of who I am as a person in the UK will change if I step into Spain, for example, and they completely view me as an abhorrent creation. And I step off the plane and suddenly I'm arrested for being a criminal because I'm enhanced. We've got some real issues to sort of tackle. And I think the first one is sitting down and working out whether the right thing to do is allow people or allow governments to separately define something as far reaching as where we're heading with emerging technology.
We're going to follow up on that question of practicality, the desirability, the feasibility of ethical frameworks from governments and others to guide how people use technology. But first, let's bring in Craig if you have comments to make on the questions that have been posed.
I agree completely. The regulation piece is fascinating. Regulation and compliance does follow technology. And I mean, you know, we have to look at places like Silicon Valley where, you know, 10 years ago, self-driving cars, there was no regulation. And so the very progressive guys said, you know, how do we, as a tech company, help you craft that regulation? The problem is traditional compliance and regulations based on precedents. I spoke to an international telecoms company about certain areas, and this is exactly the problem. What's the precedents? What's the rules? What do we do? There is none. Well, then what the hell do we do? Well, we'll just wait for someone else. Tech doesn't wait that way. The future doesn't wait that way, more appropriately, right? So that's a huge, huge challenge. But one of the outcomes, and I can't wait to get my hands on the book to see, you know, what the views are. But it's around saying, you know, it's not about how compliance and how procedures are structured in terms of form, but it's on function. It's like, what's the outcome and how do you do compliance in a just-in-time manner? So that's part of the outcomes that I had across that. David, just reflecting on your point around PESTLE and models, you know, it's interesting because one of the outcomes of my PhD is exactly on this question. The question is, what are some of the new models that have to come out? So the Futures cone, Bronwyn, that's great, and I think that's wonderful, as are a number of others, whether you're looking at, you know, scenario planning, whether you're looking at foresight tools, a whole bunch of other things, whether you Delphi, whatever. The question is, for me, and this is where my PhD is delving into, is agnostic of the tool to think about the future, how do you think about the future? And that's the point becomes very difficult, right? And Donald Rumsfeld is probably credited with the saying around the unknown unknowns back in 2002. And so one of the frameworks that I'm starting to toy with now, so this is a prelude, and I hope it doesn't put my PhD under any kind of pressure, but basically what I'm working on is an adapted version of that. where it's previously based on Johari's window for individual development. But what's the Johari's window for corporates and for societies at large, where we move and we shift away from the known knowns, unknown unknowns into the known knowns and unknown knowns, right? And where do we use certain pieces? Because David, to your point, PESTLE methodology is great if you know what the PESTLE stuff is, right? SWOT is great if you know what your strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats are. Porter's 5 forces are great in a very slow moving environment. But as we move through this crazy changing world, none of this stuff holds true anymore. So what model do we use at what time? The known knowns, that kind of quadrant, I'm just going to tee up so to give some folks some thoughts. The known knowns is when you can use these frameworks, the MBA type stuff, right? Which I've got one of these, so yeah, I'm welcome to throw jokes at these guys. But the MBA type quadrants, and it's the money that you pay the management consultants, those frameworks work well for that kind of quadrant. The unknown knowns, the known unknowns, just to mix them very quickly, that's where you need things like foresight. That's when you use the tools. That's when you use your typical futurist tools, because that's where one or both of those qualities or those metrics start changing. But the unknown unknowns, the realm of the true black swans, not COVID, the true black swans that we just don't know. The question over there is actually there is no framework. That's a way of working. That's this new, and this is the merging of design thinking and lean. And this for me is where the intersection becomes very interesting to say, well, where does futures thinking, design thinking, and lean start being? Because now from an organizational fitness point of view, it's about understanding to create organizations that are very lean, that can pivot and do stuff on demand as the unknown futures start to emerge. So to your question around models, yes, hopefully in a few years, I will be writing a book to dovetail on what my dear colleagues over here, and I'll speak a little bit more about these models, but that's my view on that.
Well, we can maybe bring you back to London Futurists when your book is finished. Let's have one more quick round. Again, you can pick up on themes you've heard from each other. I am particularly interested in this question as whether there is any hope for ethical frameworks, given that things are changing so fast and that our instincts no longer seem to be reliable, and the governments always seem to be lagging behind. And I noticed that the EU recently, it was leaked that they had some initiatives to control AI. They would forbid the use of face recognition systems in certain cases. And the response to this has been criticism on both sides. The people who cared about privacy said that the systems aren't going far enough. And by and large, the technology enthusiasts said, this is terrible. It's going to slow us down. We're going to be outcompeted by countries elsewhere in the world who aren't going to be constrained in such a way. So is this question of legal frameworks important? Do we need to worry about it? Should we instead focus on less ethically fraught technologies such as augmented reality? Is that a better place? Or is there any hope for legal systems, politicians being smarter? So that's what I would drop in, but by all means comment on other things. Let's go again, Bronwyn, then Kate, then Theo, then Craig.
Yeah, to answer your question there in terms of trying to regulate an emerging world that we don't actually know how it works, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because we either have very reactive regulation that is after the horse is bolted, or you've got a point where you are preemptively regulating to the point that you're actually dampening progress in technology and all the good stuff that comes out of it. So I've been sort of playing around with ideas, and they're not fully formed in my mind yet, but I think that the sort of principles that I'm leaning towards are pushing rather for protocols rather than policies when it comes to govern ethics, because ethics is a subjective issue for so many of us. So instead of trying to impose rules and saying, these are the things you can and cannot do, rather the sort of protocols that the regulators should be looking at are things like governing transparency, making sure terms and conditions are clear so that users are able to opt in and opt out at a much higher level. And there's sort of precedent for this. This is the way that the whole like early days of the World Wide Web were developed. It wasn't based on a law-based system. It was based on a protocol-based system, and you could sort of impose your own filters over your own life. And I like those ideas. Of course, they're quite hard to articulate, but then again, so is trying to regulate technology with the blunt instruments of a very laggedy law. So I would like to see more of that. I'd also like to see more participatory building of laws around messy, wicked problems. Again, I keep on coming back to what happened in Taiwan with the grassroots model of the citizens citizens that weren't affiliated with political parties or with the governments hacking democracy to come up and try to find ways to build bridges between technology and society and civil society and governments. And there have been sort of early signs that some of these things can help point us towards a world where laws are not imposed upon players, that would be us, citizens of the world, but rather that we are more able to have more access to the rules. Because I think that is where a lot of technology and common goods problems come about. It's due to imperfect information that allows a lot of perverse incentives to creep into play. So if I was to do anything, if I would have any sort of say over these things, I would be advocating for more transparency in the rules that are being imposed by private sector and public sector actors. And once we have certainty in the rules that are in place, certainty, rather than fighting about what those rules really are, we can make smarter decisions for ourselves, whether we individuals, organizations, or whatever else. Of course, that does come with a whole lot of caveats that we have to make sure that people are educated as to what that comes, but that's what justice really is when it comes before the law. It's understanding what your legal rights are and having access to that information so that you can make informed choices. That's the way I'm kind of leaning towards with these problems. And of course, this applies to everything from social media to augmented reality to augmented people, or whatever you want to pick up on. I did just also want to jump to the Q&A, if you don't mind me doing that, in terms of a few questions coming up with young people, automation, AI, and what the future holds there. I have a more optimistic view on this sector. I'm quite a pessimist when it comes to sort of social dynamics. I have a lot more optimism when it comes to things like the progress of technology, for better or for worse. That's where my bias leans. But I do think that a way around a lot of these issues of the sort of threat that we have of this technological unemployment, where we're all going to have to be sort of dependent on handouts because we don't have a place in society, needs to be thought about from a slightly different perspective. Jobs are going the way of the dinosaur, but jobs are a new concept. I mean, like, how long have we had employment contracts for? Not for most of history of humanity. The concept of a job where you're trading your time is something that is very easy to automate, because that gives an incentive to whoever is paying you to view you as the employee as an expense rather than as a value addition. Moving to a model where we are seeing, instead of jobs, but work, or how we're adding value to a particular value chain, supply chain, society at large, allows us to have much more productive conversations that aren't tied purely towards profit. They're also tied more towards value to society in a much bigger context. And we do have to be aware that technology up to date, when it comes to automation, has tended to create more work for us because we're very good at that as human beings. We're very good at finding new things to want. We have very strange, very human, very animal needs, the needs to improve our position in society, needs to have something to strive towards. And we're quite good at making work for each other and for ourselves, and creating essentially things that create a desire in the next person. And let's be honest, most of us that do work in the knowledge economy are not performing essential services. We're performing jobs that we've, or work that we've really invented ourselves, and being able to persuade other people that adds value to their life to pay us. I mean, quite honestly, we're practicing futurists here on this call. We're the furthest thing from a completely essential worker you can really get. So I feel like I can speak with quite a lot of authority here. At the same time, although I'm not essential in terms of the sort of essential worker criterion that happened last year, I do think that I add value to the people that I work for, and they're happy to pay me for it because I add value to their lives. So if we change that question around, suddenly all the issues about whether robots or, algorithms or machines are doing work that we don't want to A, do, and B, don't want to pay for, is no longer a problem. It just sort of allows us to experiment with value creation in very, very different ways. That's my perspective. I'm sure there's many people that would disagree with it, but I'm a bit more optimistic there than Klaus Schwab was.
I might slightly disagree about whether futurists are doing essential work. I think it's possibly some of the most essential work of all.
Essential in the sort of COVID class, like where we're allowed to go out and touch people, right? in terms of what governments declared as being essential or not, we did not make that list.
But arguably, if futurists had done things a little bit better, our voice would have been heard, and we wouldn't have stumbled globally.
I believe that. I'm with you 100%, David, but I'm talking in terms of the sort of tasks on the World Economic Forum's list. We wouldn't have made it, but we are very valuable because we've been able to carve that space for us in society. And I think that that's most humans are able to do that. That's what we've always done. We create work, we create value, and we're going to keep on doing that.
And as I hand over to Kate, I'll just read out the question that one of the questions you referred to, Bronwyn. It was by Paul Imre, who did ask, how do kids enter the new world, given that the career path often used to be you'd start off by doing a fairly routine piece of work. You'd join as a lawyer and you'd do straightforward stuff. But if the machines and AI is doing all that kind of low skill and entry-level jobs, how do we progress? So I think there's many angles to that as well. So there's a lot on the table, and I'll leave Kate to pick up any item that she wishes from that.
I think Bronwyn's comments were outstanding, and I think PNJ in the audience said in comments that you answered the question that they asked in the Q&A as well. So I think we're right on track with that. I would just push back a little bit on the discussion about policy and say, I'm not ready to give up on regulations yet. I think that there need to be some regulatory baselines to make sure that we're catching the sort of the known cases, and what we need to have teeth around, what we can anticipate needs to be governable, needs to be sort of baseline properties for all within a community. And the way I see that playing out at scale, sort of experimenting at scale, there's a question as well in the Q&A about, I think it was the same one that P&J said was answered, but I think there's a way to do this policy work in an experimental way. And I think it starts with cities. I think a lot of cities around the world have been great leaders in terms of being able to say, like, for our city, we're going to try this approach to, restricting certain kinds of technology like facial recognition. We're going to try this approach to data empowerment or so on. And then when you see how that operates within the framework of that city, I think it becomes an opportunity for whatever the next larger, in the US it's states or provinces, other places, taking it to the next level of government, and then you have the opportunity to nationalize or federalize that sort of that technology policy. That I think is sort of a way to be a little bit agile about how policy can be developed in an experimental sense. But certainly I agree, Bronwyn, that protocols make a lot of sense too. And that's why my work is focused so heavily on corporate education, talking to C-suite leaders and making sure that they're thinking holistically and futuristically about the impact of the technologies that they put in place, and that they can think in a way that's proactive and progressive and putting protections in place within their work. And I think that the only reason that they're going to feel that pressure is through collective action, through people being educated, through the communities of people knowing what it is that's happening with their data. And I love that in the book, I was just pulling up a Kindle app on my iPad to be able to cite it properly, but in the book, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming by David Wallace Wells, he points out that it typically only takes about 3% of any given population putting pressure on a government or on some sort of constituency of leadership in order to make voices heard and create some sort of a need for impact. So I think that if we take that as a guide, as a benchmark of what kind of collective action we need to see and how we might need to inspire people to make voices heard about need for data justice and need for climate action and need for all of the kinds of things that we need to see in order to make progress toward the best futures, I think collective action is going to be a really powerful force moving us in the right direction. And then I just wanted to also weigh in quickly on the automation and jobs feature, because I do think Bronwyn so beautifully said about, I think the move toward adding value is incredibly important. And the other aspect of it, I think that's so important for especially younger people and really anyone at any stage of their career, is to really focus on learning to learn and learning to be adaptable, because being able to take the skills that we have learned and created in different stages of our lives and figure out how they rematch and rehash and reapply in different contexts, and that's going to be always important. That's a truly human skill, and I think that's going to serve us no matter what our technology surroundings are, no matter what our future looks like. So that's where I would emphasize for people to really to be ready to be adaptable in their environments.
So don't plan for one career, plan for changing. Or if you are in one career, don't plan to be doing the same thing all the time.
Yeah, I think reinvention is a characteristic of my favorite people in the world. Everyone I know that I really respect and love has had to reinvent what they do or how they describe themselves at least a few times. And I think that's because people who find that they learned a thing, like maybe they were a musician in one of their lives, earlier in their career, and they figured out how to turn that into managing artists, and then they figured out how to talk about promotion, and then they figured out that what they were really doing was about data management. And then there's like all these different ways that you sort of take a nugget from one stage of your life and apply it in a different way and apply it in a different way. And I think that's a really human life path. And I think that we should be really looking to encourage people to follow that kind of path.
Theo, what's your views on the topics we were just discussing?
I have a slightly, well, I'm going to follow up on what Bronwyn said about basically inventing work. And I have a slightly controversial view on ethics. And ethics bodies, especially for emerging technologies and the discussions that we're having within the context of this and the book itself, is that I get really annoyed when I read about so many ethics bodies popping up and people joining these ethics bodies for a bit of publicity and kudos, and then the conversations don't seem to actually produce any meaningful results. And I do think that when AI pops up, or when AR pops up, or when the next, or transcendental humans or something like that pops up, the first thing that follows is around 10 different ethics or standards bodies to try and govern and opine about what we should be doing with it. And it's filled with people who just kind of sort of jump on the bandwagon a little bit and maybe aren't the best people to feed into that kind of discussion. And then obviously that carries on until the next wave of emerging technology happens, and then that kind of dies a death. But then you see the people jumping onto that bandwagon as well and having more opinions, and nothing ever results from it. And so I have a real bee in my bonnet about ethics, especially around AI just now, because there just seems to be a 15 standards body in every single country, and nothing really gets done other than just people have a monthly catch up over Zoom at the moment, and have a wee chinwag over a wine or a coffee, depending on what time of day it is. So I get really annoyed by that. The other thing, actually, looking at and touching on some of the conversations around what do we, future of work, automation, children, that kind of sort of thing, they're kind of all intertwined, and it touches on, again, Kate's point about everything is connected. So in Paul Bisnar's question, he talks about the fourth industrial revolution and low-level jobs. And I remember being in Peru for a keynote, and I was asked to be really positive. And as I was writing my speech and eventually delivering it, I found that I couldn't really be positive. I couldn't really talk about something I didn't believe in and put a positive spin on it. And the fact was that the lowest rung in the ladder would actually be removed by this kind of level of automation, and it would be blue collar kind of work, very sort of computer type based manual work, data entry kind of sort of things. Even maybe sort of the higher end stuff, where some levels of data science would be automated to an extent, and you would be sitting back doing supervisory work. And I thought, well, I can't really put a spin on this. All I can say is, my belief is that the lowest rung on the ladder that we used to think about when we left school that we would enter as our first career or first job would actually be removed, and suddenly that rung becomes slightly higher and we have to achieve or attain something higher. And then the interconnected side is that we must actually start looking at how education prepares us for that. And the whole curriculum and how we look at education needs to be reformed, and again touches on Kate's point about lifelong learning, or we just continually learn. And I remember going to an independent school to talk to the head teacher and a couple of the head students about what they were doing and what they viewed their future was. And the feedback that I got from some of them was they were actually quite annoyed that the system forces them to choose their subjects and career at the age of 13. And I'm 48 and I still don't have a damn clue what I want to do with the rest of my life. And I can't imagine asking a 13-year-old to pick subjects to define what they want to do for the next 50 years is the right way to go about it either. And so, and so we're kind of forcing them into this decision to make a career choice that will define what they do in 10 years' time for jobs that might not exist as well in 10 years, or might disappear in 5 years because we're busy automating it and not thinking about the next generation that's coming along. So there are a couple of broken connections, I think, that we need to kind of repair on that point. And then my take on universal basic income, which is everyone sees it as a silver bullet and panacea, and it is absolutely not. If you sit back and listen to who's shouting the most about universal basic income, it's the same people who are automating the jobs out of existence in a sense. So of course they see, they want to see universal basic income help because they're the ones profiting from actually removing the jobs in the first place. So I think we kind of need to take a little step back about, and what do we want to repair with universal basic income? What do we want to achieve with it? And how do we actually add value to the people who are going to be receiving it? So, do we want a class of society in a sense who are just going to be happy with their lot and sit and take this money and not actually want to do anything with it? Or how do we enable them to say, right, well, this money is actually to make sure that you are comfortable and you don't have to take that lowest rung in the ladder, but how do we make you feel valued as a member of society, and how do we give you pride in yourself and something that you want to achieve? So it doesn't have to be about work and data entry or following some other kind of footstep. You can actually learn art and be creative, or learn humanities, or learn philosophy and think again. Why don't we give people that sense of pride and being able to not feel pressured that they can't learn these things because they don't earn money from it as a career? When you look at art and things, you're always said, oh, you don't make money out of books and you don't make money out of drawing art. Get a proper job, work in a bank, become a lawyer, be a doctor, kind of sort of thing. And it's like, well, why can't we learn to do some of this stuff and not have to worry about the financial aspect? It still adds value to society if you're a creator. So there are a lot of broken connections. We need to start repairing those connections. I think what Kate's centers on in terms of everything is connected is absolutely valid. And I think we as futurists need to start making a little bit more of those connections as well, rather than focusing in on our little sort of tunnel vision that I just want to talk about economics, and I just want to talk about future of technology, and I just want to talk about flying cars. I think we should start connecting a little bit more dots and having a little bit more conversations with the other generations that we're kind of trying to create a future for.
Let me just drop in another economist at this point, John Maynard Keynes, who famously in 1930 looked ahead 100 years and said, because of the progress of technology, if we want, we'll only need to work a few hours every week. Rather than working 40 hours a week, we'll all be able to work 15 hours a week. But he said, it's all going to depend on what kind of attitudes we bring. If we bring the attitude that we've got to keep on doing more, then we're going to want to keep on working. And so I think you said earlier on, Theo, you said that you try to talk to companies about perhaps working 3 days a week would be a good approach. But I imagine there'd be a lot of resistance to that because we're all used to thinking how things have been for the last at least maybe 100 years, and we're not able to conceive these new possibilities. As you said, everything is connected. Let's move on quickly to Craig for one comments on this, and then there'll probably be time for one more round before we have to wind up after that. Craig.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, I think exactly to Theo's point and to Kate's point, everything is connected. So I'll try touch a few pieces, but I as all my talks, I have to bring the moment of cheese and cheesy slogans. So let's start over there, right? And I think your question around is there any hope? Is there anything left? Let's start on the bottom rung. And again, if you're a futurist, it's a normal kind of 2x2 matrix. But the truth of the matter is, how do we move from a state of hopeless, and I think that's the position of the dystopian future, to a place where you hope less. All right, so you're shifting up the spectrum, becoming a little bit optimistic. And how do you hope less around this? But beyond that, I think it's a question of not being that. It's by being hopeful with a single L. But obviously, the biggest one is hopeful with 2 L's. And I hope from a perspective of where we're coming from, and I can see Theo chuckling, holding your breath there, trying not to break out in laughter. But it is, I think, theoretically, and even from a pure poster moment and bumper sticker, it is a question of saying, how can we be full of hope? How can we be hopeful? Because the future can be better. It doesn't have to be, but it can be better if we so choose to, right? And I think for that, looking at the questions around regulation, I'm not an expert in this, but I will look at something that happened just last week, the European Super League. And for me, it's not about procedures. It's not about procedures. It's not about policies. It's about transparency and actually giving less people centralized power. It's about saying, how do you break down some of those power structures so more folks can have a say in things? You know, the Big 12 will say, you know, we're going to create our own league. Some folks can't be relegated. It's a power vacuum. They're creating a new power structure. And ultimately, it was the fans and players that said, we don't want to be part of this. What's the equivalent within society today? Well, it's bringing all those different constituency pieces that Kate spoke about, right? It's a social justice piece. It's the voice of private, government, public, non-profits. How do we give more voice to all different constituents, not a single holder of power, whether it's government or corporations? So I think that's the piece. Around some of the other pieces that we spoke about, around, you know, the question of jobs, etc. And Theo, exactly to your point, you know, I think it was the Minister of Education of Argentina, Esteban Bullrich, I think he said in 2016, he said a child can expect to change jobs at least 7 times over the course of their lives, and 5 of those jobs don't exist today. Right? So how do you get a job where you don't know what it is? What's the job spec for tomorrow? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I'm going to be a social media analyst. What the hell's a social media analyst, right? I'm going to be a drone operator. What's a drone? You know, and moving forward, I'm going to be a SpaceX engineer. I'm going to be a Telesat, whatever, mobile. We don't know what these things are. And it's exactly to Kate's, Neil, it's no longer about the what of education, it's the how of education. You know why, when it's the how, right? And for that, we turn towards the, you know, one of the better, maybe not the best, but one of the better futurists, Alvin Toffler, Future Shock, and he says this, you know, and we'll all use this. The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn, right? And it's that, it's the how do we make ourselves obsolete before the marketplace makes us obsolete. Then finally, just turning to Paul's question to tie these different pieces together around the question around a fourth industrial revolution. Paul, have a look at a few frameworks. The first is by a guy called Prof. David Denny from Harvard University. He did a study over 30 years where the share of jobs are going to drop over time. And basically what he says is, if you plot an axis of require social skill, don't require social skill, or pure maths, basically those that require no social skills have diminished over time. You contrast that with another model by a guy called Kai-Fu Lee, who was the CEO of Google China, a venture capitalist, and he wrote a book called AI Superpowers. And in there he has another framework, and it basically says compassion, optimization, and strategy. And the long and short of it is your job requires a lot of optimization and a low degree of not just math skills, but compassion. Your job will be taken over by some kind of technology, artificial intelligence, mechanization, RPA, whatever the heck may be, right? And the question is, in the context of the questions that came across in the chat window, it's not about being less human nowadays, it's about being more human. And what does that mean? Again, the question that Theo said and the question that I said, what does it mean to be more human? And some of those characteristics, again, is to augment. It's not to remove STEM, it's the and. It's about augmenting science, technology, engineering, maths, the glorious professions of the past. But how do you augment that with the humanity stuff? Humanity, ethics, compassion, creativity, and imagination. How do we bring those things so technology can do what it does best and humans can do what we do best? Now, that varies from person to person, but I think it's all about that. It's the and again, it's not the all.
Time has gone very quickly, and I want to draw things to a conclusion shortly. I'll give you one more chance each to maybe comment for a minute or so. But first, if I may, I want to briefly look ahead to what's happening next with London Futurists. In 15 days' time, so this is on a Sunday, not on a Saturday, we are hearing from a speaker based in Sydney, Australia, on how to talk about difficult topics, in particular the difficult topic of climate change. Rebecca Huntley is a social trends researcher, a very distinguished one, done lots of research into not just what people think about topics such as climate change, but what are the emotions involved. And she argues that if we really want to make a difference, of course, we need to talk about the science, but we also need to become much more thoughtful about all the emotions involved, the depression, the hopes, the fears, the guilt, the shame, and so on. I've been reading that book along with many others, and I found that fascinating. So that's at 10 o'clock in the morning UK time. So not very good for those on the west coast of America, but good for people in Australia and in the East. 6 days after that, we'll be moving forwards to another talk by David Hoole, who is a futurist, well known to several of us. He has written a book on a related topic, which is cognitive dissonance, which is when we want to think something, we want to believe something, but our senses, the information from the environment is telling us something different, and we are put in a state of confusion and distress. And he argues that we are likely to experience in the 2020s more cognitive dissonance than ever before. And if we want to flourish, we can't deny the cognitive dissonance. We need to become better at managing it and dealing with it. So that is back on Saturday at the usual time. There will be other London Futurist meetings soon, but that's what we are looking forward to. And now to wind up today's event, I'd like to give the speakers a chance to make final comments, perhaps just a couple of thoughts to lead you on the way. Maybe we'll go in reverse order this time. So Craig, then Theo, then Kate, then Bronwyn. Some you mentioned of science fiction. I remember a conversation with Marvin Minsky, one of the pioneers of AI. I had a chance 15 years ago, so I was sitting at a dinner table with him. And I knew he'd been at Princeton at the same time as Albert Einstein and John von Neumann and Kurt Gödel as a young man. So I sort of asked him who had influenced him the most. And to my surprise, he didn't pick any of these people. He said it was the science fiction writers from New York in the 1940s that had the biggest lasting impact on him. And so indeed, science fiction can raise our minds. So if you want to put in a plug for any science fiction you've read recently, that's one possibility. The other thing you might comment on is disagreements. Are there key disagreements in this field that you don't want to shy away from, but you would steer future discussions onto? So maybe there'd be a future London Futurist meeting about a particular topic. So let's go around in your closing remarks, and feel free also to comment briefly on anything else that's on the top of your mind. Craig.
David, thanks a lot. I mean, to read off your point around the science fiction piece, I'm not going to quote a specific one. I think there's so many, whether it's the Star Treks of this world, whether it's about the TV series that we're coming through right now, Westworld, etc. There's so many. But I think the key piece over there is, as I alluded to, what does it mean to be more human? And within the context I spoke about, to summarize, was something called HECI, humanity, ethics, creativity, and the last one, there was imagination, creativity and imagination. And the imagination piece is the most important one, because it gives us the ability to dream beyond what we see right now. It gives us the ability to see, exactly as the title of the book, the future starts now. How do we make that future? Right? So I think it's really about the imagination. And again, to come back to the point that was made by Kate and Theo and Bronwyn alluded to us, our current education system beats it out of us, right? The current education system is you start school and you have some imagination and creativity, but as you move through the levels, whether you go to high school, university, postgrad, etc., it's no longer about imagination. It's about conformism. And it's about saying, well, it's not only about that, it's about saying, how do you make a better widget, as opposed to dreaming out, why do we even need a widget? And I think that's the key point across that. So I think that's the one piece. The other piece, and I started with in terms of what I want to be part of this book, and it's a closing statement, is let's have these conversations. So it's to London Futurist, yourself, David, and to Bronwyn and Theo, the future indeed belongs to all of us. I think certainly in my early days as a futurist, the glitz and glamour of being on stage and saying things is great. And frankly, it will still be great. But that's not where the conversation should be had. The conversations need to be had on platforms like this, at the pub, as per the chat windows coming through. Let's have a chat, let's see, because ultimately it's the disagreements. And yes, there will be disagreements, David, and there must be disagreements, because again, the future's indeterministic. It's the collision of ideas that makes things better. It's the pushing of envelopes. It's about saying, well, how do we work within the and, not the or? Again, I've spoken about this several times tonight, but it's about saying, how do we have more conversations, not less? And that's in where the book starts. Conversations, use the book as a proxy to have conversations with your loved ones, with your friends, with your strangers that live next door to you, whatever it may be. But it's all about the conversations, because the future belongs to all of us. And so from our side, thank you very much, David, Theo, and Bronwyn, as well as Kate, to greet and meet you.
Well, I give a thumbs up for imagination and ideas as well. I noticed that those who are watching on the YouTube live stream, some of them have commented there that we are a bit naive to think that we can steer what happens in any sense, that technology is just going to come along and do things. I actually disagree. I think that ideas can change the world, and imagination can change the world too. And if we just let technology go wherever it wants, we may end up in a very sad place indeed. If we steer it wisely, we could end up in a wonderful place. Over to you, Theo, for some closing remarks.
I'll carry on that point, actually. It's interesting, because then that just suggests that we've become apathetic and we just can't be bothered having the conversation. I think that's the absolutely wrong thing, wrong attitude to take. So whoever you are, I'm sorry, but I'm just going to lambast you. And a good sort of indication of that is if you look at Black Mirror, for example, it was a wonderful piece in terms of dystopian TV and highlighting how quickly it can degenerate and technology can lead us down dark paths. And the interesting thing is that now we've now reached a point where I don't think Charlie Brooker can actually write anything more dystopian than real life, because we've kind of accelerated beyond what Black Mirror thought was parody and satire. I really enjoyed doing this book, and I think the whole point of the project was to allow us to have these kind of sort of conversations, and to, I guess, force open doors that we thought were closed. I think we should have more conversations with generations that are following behind us. One of the chapters in the book actually talks with someone called Arsam, who classes himself as the world's youngest futurist, and he's around 10 or 12 years old. And there is actually a whole movement of 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds who have this kind of sort of futurist mindset and want to be involved. And they don't need a degree, and they didn't need formal training. They just have that key ingredient, which is imagination. And this is partly the reason why my bookshelves are filled with science fiction, is because of the imagination of old. It just seemed that they seemed to go everywhere. And back in the 40s and the 50s, there was actually a movement called the Futurians, which were a group of science fiction authors, Frederick Pohl being one of them, who's one of my favorites. They grouped together and they kind of sort of formed this science fiction community called the Futurians. And I had this idea where we should actually start to mix futurism with science fiction again and involve science fiction authors as part of our daily conversations, because they're dreaming up all these weird and wonderful scenarios. And we sometimes get caught up in the academic side, that we should actually talk to these guys for fresher ideas, involve them in the academic side, and actually mingle the two when we go to talk to clients or when we start having strategic discussions. So I think there's a lot of avenues that I would love to see this book take, or certainly in terms of the conversations that it can open up. I'd love to do a sequel if this book is actually well received among the community, and if there's a call for it. Bronwyn and I would probably call up on another 20 people, another 20 futurists, to come up with 20 other different perspectives and angles and topics to cover, and continue that conversation again. So those are my closing remarks.
Theo, would it be called The Future Starts Now Again?
Again.
Again.
I'll have to think about that one.
The future is really starting now.
Now.
Okay, now.
It's happened before.
Thanks, Theo. Kate.
I think the closing remark I'd like to have out there is just, I think Craig really hit it with talking about hope, and hopeless versus hopeful versus hopeful. I like your cheesiness, Craig. It really relates. I think for me, one of the things that I have learned in trying to build a model around strategic optimism, what I learned about hope in trying to apply some mental rigor to this process, is that hope is a tool of focus. And when we hope for is an indication of what we are focused on. And we actually have control over what we hope for in many cases. So I think we get the chance to determine where we're going to apply our energies and our focus. And we get to use ideas and imagination to try to achieve the best of those outcomes. And that's where I think hope is an incredible tool. And it's not at all being naive to try to influence these tech outcomes. I think hope is an incredibly important part of this human involvement in determining the future of technology, because we need to know what it is we want these things to do. And if we can articulate what it is we want them to do, we can work toward that, and we can make that be the efforts that we expend toward that outcome.
So hope, that's the strategic optimism angle you mentioned.
That's
earlier.
one of the pieces of it, for sure.
And the very chapter I'm listening to now in Rebecca Huntley's book on how to talk about climate change is the importance of hope.
That's
So,
great. I think, loss aversion is such an important, loss aversion is an important piece of how we motivate ourselves, but so is hope. And I think it's incredibly important that we hold on to that piece.
Many thanks. Bronwyn, final comments from you, please.
Yeah, I love what Kate was saying. I think it does echo a lot about what I actually wrote about in the book too, because I was writing about privacy and about personal identity. And I think that having some sort of sense of agency over your own life, over your own future, as an individual, also as part of a community, whether that's a local community or a national community, or the human species at large, you have to have that sense of agency if you're going to have a sense of A, meaning, and B, hope that something is worth working towards. Otherwise, you might as well just sit exactly where you are right now. And that's really what I hope, if people do read this book, that at least fires you up, either scares you or inspires you, or a bit of both. So actually take those steps and to have a sense of active agency over what comes next, to get past being passive recipients of someone else's second-hand future. And that whole concept of second-hand future is something that Theo and I spoke about a lot when we were pitching this concept to the other writers and to the publishers and to everyone else that was involved. We need new, fresh ideas. We need something to be excited about. We need something to be hopeful about. Give us something meaningful to work and to walk towards as individuals and as a society, because all the big issues are so dark right now. Things like climate change and things like artificial intelligence seem so big, they seem so overwhelming, and they seem so dark, like there's nothing you can do about it. But I mean, even the conversation we've had today, we've unpacked some of those issues, and you see there are kind of ways around it. And when you just change your mindsets to having a sense of humor about these things, and also a sense of hope and agency, suddenly they become challenges. They don't become overwhelming. And really, we have to keep walking. We can't just sit down and give up. I mean, whether we're born, we know we're going to die one day. We're not transhuman and immortal yet, and our species might have an end point, but it's very, very human for us to want to sort of rage against the dying of that life. And I think we should be doing more raging against the things that we don't want. So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. I'm pretty sure that we've been talking a lot longer than we should have been tonight.
But not long enough. I mean, the conversations have just got started, but we need to take a break. We need to let people get on with their lives. But I hope, and I believe that many of the threads that have been started here will be in people's minds. One comment is that quite a few of the audience have been relatively shy today for whatever reason, but if you are wanting to continue this discussion immediately, there is an option to go to the virtual pub. Brian from Canada, one of the co-organizers of London Futurists, has created a Google Meet. You see the link in the chat window, so I'll leave it up for a few minutes before I shut the webinar down. If you want to drop in for 10-15 minutes or so and continue some of the discussion, you're welcome to do that. And all that remains for me to say is to say thank you very much to Craig, Kate, Theo and Bronwyn, and to encourage the audience to get involved with the book. There is a discount code in the latest London Futurist newsletter to get 25% off the list price. I think it is Futurists 25. And yes, it's a very attractive book. And thanks to everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.